Let's get to it. Today we're talking about class tensions in the 19th and 20th centuries. In order to really get into that, we're going to have to backtrack just a little bit because it's important that we establish what the classes actually are and where they come from. So we'll go back just a little bit and remind everybody that European culture started feudalistically. It started with feudalism, okay? And feudalism was the king, and underneath the king were their lords, their nobles, the dukes and the earls and the people who were in charge of the administration of various geographical places, like, you know, the Duke of Normandy and places like that. And underneath them were the knights that were loyal to them, right? And the knights also had some administrative duties because a lot of times the knights were castellans. They were castle-owning knights, castellans. And underneath them was an entire class of working people called serfs, okay? And there were peasants and serfs. There were peasants that belonged to people and peasants that just scraped out an existence outside of belonging to people. But it was all kind of people who survived by farming and then providing that food to somebody else. So this is feudalism at its most basic, okay? In the midst of this, craftsmen began to rise up and produce things and then sell them at those trading centers that always formed between villages that got bigger and bigger. And craftsmen don't grow their own food, have some kind of skill that they trade on. They create something and then they sell it. And in exchange for that, they're able to buy food from the people that make the food. They're able to buy shelter from the people that make the shelter. So this entire merchant class became its own thing kind of outside of this feudal structure, okay? There's no place in this feudal structure for merchants, but they do start to, as cities start to form.
Hey, Mindy, I don't know if you have the PowerPoint up, but you're not sharing it at all.
Oh,
Jeez Louise.
I was just about to say the same thing.
thank
She
you,
told you
Bella.
she got a vaccine shot.
So this week I
Sorry,
got a
Sam.
vaccine shot and had a funeral. Okay, so I'm gonna, see, the problem is now it's not gonna, now none of these PowerPoints are gonna show up on the Zoom unless I start over. I don't really wanna do that, so y'all are just gonna have to deal, basically. Okay. Class tensions, things, the middle class with the feudal and the lords and all that stuff. Okay, so we were talking about the merchant class anyway. So as trade gets established with other places, like as trade starts to come up the Silk Road, merchants begin to trade in things they don't actually make. They just get to acquire things and then resell them at a higher price. They figure out how to go to a faraway place and get something and bring it to a nearby place and sell it to you for more than you would pay if you went to the faraway place. That's the whole job of merchants. They don't always, or they don't have to be craftsmen. They rely on craftsmen, but they don't have to be themselves craftsmen. But as they form these connections, they pool wealth. Okay, because they buy something and then they sell it for more expensive. They manage to pool wealth. And as they pool wealth, they buy things like bodyguards. They buy things like military force. And then they start to buy things like nobles. They begin to use their wealth to influence nobles. Nobility becomes dependent on the merchant class. And then merchants themselves begin to become more powerful than the nobles that whose families go back generations and generations. It becomes possible for somebody to rise up through the merchant class and become wealthier than any of the local nobles. So we have this like group of families in the Middle Ages that starts to emerge as merchant families. And because they're merchant families and are so wealthy, nobility marries into them. And now we have a power class. And this is the rise of the middle class. This is the rise of the Habsburgs is based in merchant trading. The rise of the, oh, who else is there? Let me think. The Medici class, the Medici family is a huge, powerful merchant trading family that also marries into royalty and nobility and ends up on the French throne as a result. But they started as merchants. They started as traders. But the fact that they're able to make all of these connections makes it possible for them to be the power of the government that influences the king, that influences the nobles. They become really powerful. So in the 1600s, nobles with wealth began to pool their wealth and form companies specifically to trade. These are joint stock companies. So they would pool their wealth and they would finance ships and captains whose job it was to go out, and they had to do this with permission of the monarch. So joint stock companies received a charter from the Queen. The English East India Company was established by Queen Elizabeth, for example, and their whole job was to float into India, was to sail into India, establish trading bases, and start to influence trade in India. Because India had a bunch of products that England didn't. India had the land to make products that England didn't. She establishes the East India Company, and then her successor, James I, establishes the London Company and the Virginia Company, which you would be more familiar with if I said, you know, the Plymouth Company, probably. These are the companies that ended up setting up colonies in North America. This allowed both merchants who had money and nobles who had title to pool their assets together and then make a profit off of foreign trade, okay? So, and the crown was a part of that because they had to have the charter to do it. Oh, here they are, the joint stock companies that you're familiar with probably. The London Company the London Company was split into the Virginia Company and the New England Company. The Virginia Company established Jamestown in Chesapeake Bay, and the New England Company later will establish Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. So, I'm sorry, were y'all still trying to get that down? People scribbling. Okay, so joint stock companies are a way that the merchant class becomes really powerful in Parliament. Okay, and because, do I have cash crop colonies? I do. Okay, because the colonies that they established in England, in North America, and South America are cash crop colonies, then trading those cash crops across the water becomes a profitable thing. Again, you get something from far away, you bring it close by, you get to charge more money for it than the people would pay if they just went and got it themselves. So cash crop colonies get established, and then products move from one coast to another, and then that whole trade just expands and expands and expands in what we call the triangle trade. Okay, so an example of the triangle trade is sugar to rum to slaves. So the West Indies grew sugar cane. They had sugar cane plantations. That sugar is transported up to the colonies of New England, of North America, where it's turned into rum. You have to have sugar cane to make rum. Then rum is traded, really traded to Europe, which is then used to finance the purchase of more slaves to work the sugar cane, which is used to make the rum, which is used to buy the slaves, which is used to, there were a lot of different products that worked on this triangle trade, on this interdependence. And it was very lucrative, and as it grew, the people who were invested in it, the person who owns the shipping company that moves the slaves, the person who owns the sugar plantation, the person who processes the rum, the person who markets the rum in Europe, all of the people grow and grow and grow into more of a powerful middle class. Now, what the crown tries to do in almost all these situations is set it up so that all the money will flow through them. So that all of the money through all of this triangle trade will flow through the crown. You want all of the trade to happen in the ports of London, so that everybody has to go through London in order to trade. That way, England stays invested in the cash crops from their English colonies. Same is true of France. The French colonies want all trade to go through France, so that France gets to keep control of it. The problem, and that's supposed to build up wealth. You know, the more trade that comes through you, the more wealthy, the more money you're allowed to grab, the more of the profit you're allowed to keep. But the enforcement of mercantilism is really difficult. In order to force people to only trade through you and not to trade for somebody else, you have to pay for troops. You have to pay for soldiers. You have to pay for, and like the East India Company ends up with something like 60,000 troops of its own. Like it ends up with its own military force, with a fleet of its own naval vessels that are capable of firing on other vessels. It ends up with a whole military force just to force mercantilism to work, and that is incredibly expensive. I don't know if you know, but military expenses are big expenses. So it's actually really difficult to enforce mercantilism. And you know who actually benefits most from the fact that mercantilism is so hard to enforce? The merchant class, because they still manage to trade no matter what. Either they trade with the people they're supposed to, or they trade with the people they're not. Either way, the merchant class continues to grow. So in the mid-1800s, a revolution hit. It started in Great Britain, where the process of taking raw materials and turning them into goods. They began to trade for cotton and flaxseed and then turn them into textiles. That's actually how it started. And gathering people from the countryside to work in these textile mills to make that their whole life, even though it meant they would never own their own farms, they would always have to pay for their own groceries. That is the crux of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, it started in England with a system of mills, of machines that were invented specifically to turn cotton and flax into cloth. And even though it was illegal, one person who grew up in that system, Samuel Slater, it was illegal to document how those machines worked and sell that information to other countries. So he didn't, he just memorized it. He memorized how it worked. He fled to America and basically rebuilt it from memory. So America could have its own textile mills, which is a shame for Britain because that's where they were buying all their cotton and flaxseed and stuff from, was America. There are cotton plantations in India too. It's a different kind of cotton. So they were buying cotton from the American South, and now America is able to have its own textile industry and is able to have its own factories. So whenever America gets a hold of something, and I'm going to skip a big chunk of this because I think it's pretty familiar. Whenever America gets a hold of a technology, it changes it to suit America, and then it claims it invented it. That's something that happens a lot in American history. So we always say Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. He didn't. He borrowed one from India and he reworked it so that it worked on American cotton. And as a result, it increased cotton production by a lot in the South American colonies, in the South American states. By this point, they're states, they're not colonies. And it also increased the need for slaves because the more cotton you could process, the more cotton you needed to grow, and the more cotton you needed to pick. And picking cotton is not something I have a machine that works for. So they need slaves to pick the cotton. So it actually boosts how many slaves there are because they're able to process cotton.
Hey, Mindy,
Yes.
it wasn't until 1954 that a cotton picking machine was invented. And I've talked to folks here in Texas who actually weighed the cotton that the pickers picked in the fields. It's very interesting.
Oh, yeah. Is it more productive or less productive than having people do it?
Oh, it's much more productive. The machine could do in, I don't know, like in an hour what a grown man could do, take all day to do. Actually, it's better than that. I don't know the exact ratio, but it was tremendous increase.
So you got to ask yourself, American ingenuity being what it is, if they could not have had slaves, if they just had, that was just not an option, when would they have invented that machine? Very quickly. Do you think they would have invented the machine sooner? I don't know. Anyway, American ingenuity is great until somebody forgets to invent something. Eli Whitney is also incidentally responsible for the concept of interchangeable parts. And this is most reflected in weapons because it used to, you would have somebody whose job was to make an entire rifle. And when that rifle broke or needed to be fixed, you took it back to the person who made it and they would either fix it or make you a new one. Eli Whitney invented the idea of all the parts of a rifle being identical so that if something broke on the rifle, you could just replace it with an identical part. I don't want you to get confused and think about Henry Ford and factories where people are putting together things, you know, what is that called?
Assembly line.
Assembly line style. That's not true. That's not what happened. But somebody would have the parts for all of the different rifles and would put them all together. A riflesmith would do that. So he invented the concept of interchangeable parts. England invented railroads. Technically, England invented railroads, places where wagons could be pulled along by less horses because they were guides for the wheels. You can see that a passenger railroad was pulled by a horse and coal, you know, being pulled by a horse. But it was an American engineer who invented the steam locomotive, who made it possible for not to use a horse, for to burn something and make steam in order to power the locomotive, and that moved back over to England and moved back into Europe and became a way that raw materials could be transported much faster. So the class of people that benefits the most from transportation are the people that are going to take raw materials and change them into goods, and then need to take those goods and take them to where they can be sold. So any change in the transportation industry benefits the middle class. The other use of the steam engine is, of course, a steamboat. Robert Fulton believed that if you put a steam engine on a boat, you could actually travel north up the Mississippi, which everybody thought was crazy because there's no way to travel north on the Mississippi. It's too powerful a current. But he managed to pull it off. So railroads in the US with the invention during the 1800s, here they start in 1830, here they are in 1840, and here they are by 1850. So this is all before the Civil War, but you can see how the entire like New England area just turns red with railroads. Suddenly they're just everywhere. And the reason for that is because you want your goods to get to those port cities as quickly as possible so that they can be shipped across the ocean to England. And this is after England is no longer their mercantile leader, so they're doing it purely to trade. There are also some communications jumps in communications. This is the original telegraph, the Cook and Wheatstone telegraph. The needle pointed at the letter, and it relied on the wires being connected over long distances. So it wasn't very, it wasn't until Samuel Morse, who was an American, took the telegraph away from whoever had invented it and figured out a way to make it so that it wasn't reliant on needles pointing at things, it was reliant on the language of clicks, which allowed it to be audio signals that could travel underwater. So we have all of these revolutions in communication and these jumps ahead in innovation that make it possible for factories to be formed and for people to begin to staff those factories. And the populations that worked in those factories a lot of times were the part of the family that wasn't as necessary for agriculture. So a lot of factories were places for young girls to go and work, to earn some money for their family without becoming a household employee instead, without becoming a maid or something like that, without becoming a nanny or maid. They would go and they would work for a wage, and they would come home and bring that wage to their parents, and their parents would then use it to theoretically take care of them. Inside a lot of those factories, they tried to impose a sense of moral order so that you would feel safe sending your daughters to work at that factory. So you have like the Lowell factory girls, which was, they were required to be modest and meek, and they were taught how to comport themselves in a way that was, you know, ladylike, but also to be hard workers. And then in exchange for that, they were taught to read. They were given a working wage, which they were allowed to take home themselves. So what happens is that because there are all of these leaps in industry, populations from the countryside begin moving into the cities. And because they're moving into the cities begin to grow. So the more people begin to work in factories, the larger the cities get, the more people will move into them. And so we end up with whole communities being built around the idea of producing a good from a raw material you didn't own into a good you don't own. And somebody else sort of at the top becoming rich as a result. Places where there are famines going on, which happens in the 1800s quite a bit. I'm not going to talk too much about the potato famine because I'll get off on a tangent on that. But in celebration of St. Patrick's Day, we should mention one of those big famines had to do with potatoes. As a result, there are these great migrations of people who are being moved into areas and then taking jobs and learning how to do them. And sometimes they're very repetitive jobs. They require a lot of people to do them, but those people don't have to be really specific, you know, skilled laborers. They just have to be able to work the machines they work. And there are several populations that this happens to. There's a big influx of Irish laborers who come into several different countries because, you know, they ran out of their one big food source, which was potatoes. And then there is also an influx of people fleeing, really not in the 1850s, more like 1870, There's an influx of African Americans fleeing from the South to the North after the Civil War because they perceive that there's going to be hostility about their presence in the South. So they begin to flee into the northern cities, and there are big influxes of that. And then there are just people moving from Europe to America in wildly large numbers. And the factories of New York and Boston and Connecticut and Rhode Island, all of the factories around that area are taking advantage of this immigrant labor. So let's talk a minute about those classes and what we call them. Because we're studying Marx, we're going to use Marx's terms for them. The bourgeoisie is the class of people that rose up through that merchant middle class and now owns the means of production. They own the factories, they own the trading routes, they own the shipping companies, they own some part of that process, and they profit off of it. Okay, so it's not the person who works in the factory, it's the factory owner. And it might not even be the factory manager, it's the factory owner. It's the person who might own several factories, who might own several ships. It's the investor. That's the bourgeoisie. Beneath that are the people who work in those factories, and that's the proletariat. Okay, those are the people who, what they have to sell is their labor, and that's what they have, and they sell that labor every day. That's what your reading assignment was for today. It was Marx's Wages and Capital, and I don't want to talk too long about it because I do actually want you to read it, but Marx draws a big difference. Or we have him. Let's talk about him first, and then we'll talk about what he wrote. Okay, Karl Marx studied the relationship between the middle class and the working class. This new landless, propertyless, all they have to sell is their labor, working class, and the relationship they have with the whole rest of the country. And he used the French specifically for this. He used the French. But this is a pretty dismal picture. It says, I don't know if you can read it from where you are, but it says, we work for all, we feed all, and that's that class. And then it says, we shoot at you, we fool you, we rule you, capitalism. So he had opinions about how the system worked and whether or not it was good. This is the pyramid of the capitalist system. At the top, you have the rulers, the people who are, who have the governmental power, and underneath that you have the church. We fool you to keep you in order. It was Marx who said that it was the opiate of the masses, right? I don't remember, but it might have been him. I don't know. And then the military who's under their control. What he perceived was that what happened was that there was an entire class of people, these people here, who have no property, but what they do have is what he calls labor power. Okay, not labor itself, because your work doesn't get paid more if your work is better. You get paid by the hour. So you're selling hours of your life. So that's labor power. I'm going to use an example, and I'm sorry for doing this, Othello, but I'm going to use you as an example. Is that okay? Are you there?
Yeah, that's fine.
Because if you're not there, it's easier.
Can you not hear me?
No, I
Are
can.
you
Okay,
you
so I'm
talking
gonna
to
use
me?
Othello. No, I'm gonna use Othello as an example. Okay, so Othello, I'm just gonna Othello works in customer service. Okay, and in the last month or so, he's changed from one customer service account to another. Okay, in one customer service, he might work 8 hours a day, and in this other account, he works 8 hours a day. That's not correct, I know, but that's not the point. During the first account, he was always
Actually, more
busy.
like 10.
Okay, fine. He was always busy. The calls that he got were nonstop, okay, because it was about people's internet connection, okay? And so he got calls constantly, all the time. He sold his labor at an hourly rate, okay, because he's an hourly employee. When he got and moved into a new account, it's hunting and fishing licenses. So he works this a chunk of hours, that's a similar chunk of hours for a similar amount of pay, but he spends large amounts of time sitting there waiting for the phone to ring. Okay, good work if you can get it, especially if you have homework that's due. But anyway, whatever.
Right, because that's totally how I spend that time.
Yeah, sure. Especially if you have games to play. The point of that is that what he was selling was his labor power, not actual work. Okay, so we have an entire class of people that sells their labor power to the person that's most willing to pay them for the highest bid. And for that amount of time, they belong to whatever structure has bought their labor power. Okay, but because they don't own anything else, they belong to the capital class as a whole. So everybody in here that's an hourly employee, according to Marx, you may not keep the hourly job that you have now, but you belong to whoever will pay hourly wages. Like you belong to the entire class of people. You belong to the bourgeoisie, because if you're not going to sell your hourly, your hours of your life to one person, you're going to try to find somebody else to sell it to. Okay, because that's who you are as a class. Does that make sense? So y'all need to read that document on labor power for later, because it'll probably come up on the test. He saw this as the beginning of a trend that was going to lead to something else. Now, he studied the French Revolution. He studied Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said everybody would be so much happier if they would just give everything that they had to the society, and then the society would take care of everybody, and nobody would have personal property to make them miserable. That was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who said that. He studied with Engels, who was a product of the Industrial Revolution, who worked his whole life in the industries of England and saw all these miserable people who were every single day sold hours of their lives that they couldn't get back. You know, he studied with these people, and he had his prediction about the way this was going to go was that money would continue to pour into the middle and upper classes, and the proletariat would just get poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer. And eventually, all of the money from even the upper middle classes would pull up into just a few elite billionaires. Okay, it would start to pool into a very small population, and the money that was left for everybody else would just get smaller and smaller and smaller, until there was such a small class of people who actually had money that all the wealth of the world would just gather into a couple of hands, that everybody else would suddenly realize that they didn't have anything, and that all of the wealth was in the hands of just a few. And then something would happen, and he's not real specific about what, but a spark would ignite like that. And that spark would ignite a revolution all over the world, the entire proletariat, which everybody's proletariat by this time, because everybody has nothing. There's the middle class is disintegrated into the proletariat. The upper middle class is disintegrated into the proletariat. Everybody's proletariat now. The only people that own anything are this, tiny group of elites. And then there would be a spark that would ignite, and all of the proletariat would unite and overthrow those few people that have the wealth. They would seize the wealth, and it would be distributed evenly across the world, and all of society would become this socialist utopia where everybody's taken care of, and we're never falling for that thing about making money for ourselves again. Okay, that was, huh? That was Marx's prediction about the way capitalism was going to go, because to him it looked like there was no way for it not to stop. The wealthier were going to keep getting wealthy, and the poorer were going to keep getting poorer. That was, he couldn't see any way for that to stop. What do you think about that? When you think about things like,
I mean, he's not wrong.
when you think about the fact that if you tax the 3 wealthiest people in America, you'd have enough money to pay the entire deficit.
Did you hear Bernie go after him?
Yeah. When you think about that, do you think he was seeing something that might actually be happening?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the tricky thing
Yeah.
is that his theory, and this is just me speaking, I've looked at it and I said, well, he's forgetting something, and that's innovation and adaptivity in the middle class. He's forgetting that people do act to improve their own lot. They adapt to their own lot. So the idea of everybody being helpless, penniless, united in their misery is probably not true, because there will always be some people who are like, I could do a little better for myself, and therefore won't want to join an overthrowing revolution. So he forgets about that middle class keeps reinventing itself. That's why it never happened.
Generally, it's true though.
But as an overall arc, it is true that capitalism causes the wealthy to get wealthier and the poor to get poorer. Okay, so this is what he said, the natural end of that is a revolution. Okay, that's what he believed would happen. In the wake of his writings, all across Europe, which was seeing this happen, they were seeing people who used to have land to work, who were now selling themselves 8 hours, 10 hours at a time, selling their lives away, marching into factories where The bosses, the bourgeois would, cut costs by cutting safety where their own lives didn't seem to be worth much. Suddenly, all over the place, people were like, hey, I like this idea of a socialist utopia, and we're joining socialist movements. So around 1848, we see this, even around like 1812, we see socialist party candidates in the American elections. We see 1848, we see socialist revolutions cropping up all over Europe. People who believe that they want to seize the assets of the upper class and use them to better the lives of the lower class. That's something that's happening all over the place. And they range from socialist as in, let's take a little bit more money away from the rich and provide, I don't know, education and healthcare for the poor, old age insurance of some kind so that people don't just die of old age and starve to death, maybe, to people who want to seize everything from the rich and basically burn their houses down. So there's a whole range of socialist movements that take place. But what they all have in common is that they actually agree with Marx. On some level, they agree with what he had to say. What's interesting is that the place where somebody first tries to make it happen, to make this revolution, this one here, the spark ignite, the first place that somebody tries to make it happen is in Russia. Now, we talked the other day about Russia. What's Russia like at the end? I mean, the whole point of Marx's prediction is because of the Industrial Revolution and the separation of the factory owners from the poor and all of this capitalism that's going to happen in the upper classes, this spark will ignite. What do we remember about the state of Russia at the beginning of the mid 1800s, early 1900s? There is no middle class. Yeah, they're feudal. They're still feudal. They are still peasants from the Middle Ages in Europe. The way that they're set up is still feudalistic. But a movement led by Lenin, and we'll talk a little bit more about Lenin next week, but a movement led by socialist radicals decides that, okay, if the key is the proletariat has to rise up and seize the wealth of the upper class, why don't we just seize it for them? And then we'll just manage it, and we'll just go ahead and get to the other side of this socialist revolution and get to this socialist utopia ourselves. Okay, and he engages in what's called collectivism, which is that he, after overthrowing the Tsar, after capturing Moscow, after imposing an army of very angry proletariat labor people, he manages to seize power. He begins to seize the property of every person in Russia. Okay, so that nobody is allowed to hold on to their property. Anybody want to guess what happens in Russia as a
People
result?
get mad and want their property back.
Weirdly, no.
People eat their babies.
Yes, people starve to death or eat their children to prevent themselves from starving to death. If you look at the era following Lenin and Stalin, during that era, so that we have more deaths from famine and neglect than in any period in history since like the Black Plague.
Why is it a paranoia?
Say again?
Is that different from the infanticide in Japan?
Well, the infanticide in Japan wasn't like a wave of it was just a practice that was steadily growing.
Yeah, no, they would hunt children.
Hmm?
They would hunt children in Stalin, Russia.
Yeah,
Because they were easy prey.
yeah. This is we don't get a lot of we didn't get a lot of propaganda on this. Because one of the other things that almost always happens when communist forces overtake a country is that they impose a lockdown of the media, like immediately.
Like North Korea.
Hmm?
Like North Korea.
Like North Korea, which is not really communist. It's what's the word I'm looking for? It's fascist dictatorship surrounding a royal regime. So it's not communist, it's something else, but it's close. It's collectivized. It's definitely collectivized. Anytime that somebody tries to impose the socialist utopia on a country that didn't get there naturally, what happens instead is called collectivization. And what happens as a result of that is people try to get their property back and get killed by the secret police. And people starve to death because the government apparently, this all relies on the idea that a committee of completely selfless, non-greedy people will be in charge of distributing your wealth, will be in charge of distributing all the assets of the country so that everybody gets what they need. And the weird thing is almost everywhere that this happens, there's corruption in that committee. It's almost like people aren't really wired to be 100% socialist. But I don't know, because the truth is, his socialist utopia, his prediction was not, this is something we should make happen. He was saying this is just the natural course that capitalism is going to take on its own over time. But anybody who tries to force it to happen finds out within a couple of generations that it was horrible. Okay. How much time? Who's got what time it is?
It's 8:57.
Oh, okay, we got a little bit of time. Okay, so it starts in Russia, and immediately Russia becomes like it becomes a nightmare. But the people of Russia don't always know that, and the people outside of Russia don't always know that. And we are going to talk about that a little bit more next week, because a lot of what happens during that happens between World War I and World War II. So a lot of that, what you're talking about, the widespread famine and the deaths and the cannibalism and the widespread disease and the seizing and moving an entire population so that they can serve in factories that weren't even there 20 years before. A lot of that happens between World War I and World War II. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But the point is that anybody who tries to force Marx's vision to happen runs into this wall of, if it doesn't happen naturally, people aren't going to do it. People don't actually want to rise up. People like for things to, with stability, security. People want their lives to be peaceful. So if there's any possibility it's going to fail, they're not going to participate. And people are happy taking care of themselves and not being part of a bigger picture of utopian grace. I mean, people are happy just earning enough for their own families and maybe having a path to greater wealth later. So, and those are all things I think Marx didn't take into account, was the adaptability of the lower classes to
Hey, Mindy.
situation. Yes.
Mindy, was it Jamestown that was set up as a sort of a socialist economy initially, and then they found out it didn't work because too many people just laid around and waited for somebody else to do the hunting and gathering? I'm asking.
I don't think you're wrong. I don't think I've ever heard it put that way, but I don't think that you're wrong. I think the closest in history that we get to something that looks a lot like socialism is probably the Inca in Peru, because the Inca actually had their whole system set up so that everything that was farmed, everything that was created was put into districted warehouses, and then the government would distribute what was in those warehouses to the populations of the villages. But there were people who answered to the government in charge at every level, and their job was to gather everything up and then distribute everything out. And the only reason it worked as well as it did is because one of the things that poured into the central government from the villages was soldiers. Every village had a quota of soldiers, and you wanted your soldiers to be well fed. And so they were very intentional about making sure everybody actually did have what they needed so that they could selfishly recruit healthy soldiers out of all those villages. And that was a system that worked really well until they had a war of succession, which broke them apart. And then Pizarro showed up and took advantage of it and kind of shot Atahualpa. Anyway, but for the closest you can get to an actual environment where that's the case is probably the Inca in Peru. I think what Jamestown had was more feudal. I think what you had in Jamestown was you actually had a nobleman in charge who didn't know how to noble. He was a nobleman who didn't know how to be, how to take care of people. And then underneath that, you had a bunch of men who had come as explorers, not so much workers. They didn't intend to be laborers. And so when he said, build things and make food, they were like, yeah, sure, we'll get to it. So it almost is feudal what happens in Jamestown. And as a result, they end up starving, and they do eat some people. Cannibalism is more widespread than we realize. Okay.
Wow.
There's evidence in the
Gosh,
starving.
Joe, this veal is delicious. Made it myself.
It's probably pork, not veal. But
It's long pig.
Yes. Anyway, say what?
Okay.
All right, just to jump into this other completely subject real quick before we get into this. Nationalism And the Industrial Revolution also creates a system of others. The people moving into the cities makes it more obvious that there are divisions within the cities, that there are divisions within the population. Probably the biggest way that this is reflected is in the Jewish population. For a long time during the Middle Ages and up into the Renaissance and the Reformation, Jews were never allowed to own property. They were never allowed to own farms. They were never allowed to own land. So Jews have been living in the cities close, and they were protected by the king. So Jews have been living in the capitals around where the king was for a long time. They were a protected population within the capital as long as they were within range of the king, and as long as they didn't try to do something stupid like own property. Jews also had a different moral code about certain things. For example, I don't know if you know this, but as a Christian, according to the scripture, you're not supposed to borrow money at interest. I don't know if you know that.
If they run a bank.
It's in the scripture. It says that's bad. Okay, you're not supposed to loan money at interest, and you're not supposed to borrow money at interest. And there was a time when Christian populations actually kept track of that. And because of that, since they couldn't do it, they let the Jews do it. So Jews became the population that was most responsible for money lending and collecting on loans, and they lived in the urban centers. As populations began to move into the centers, it became more obvious that there was a whole population that was settled into the urban life that already kind of had access to a lot of urban advantages as a result. That caused people to become resentful. That caused non-Jewish people to become resentful of the Jews that they now felt themselves shuffling with. Like, here I am selling my labor for an hourly rate, and here you driving a much nicer car than I am because you have been here for generations loaning money, and that's your family's legacy, you know. Because they couldn't own property and because they had to excel at whatever they did, they also invested very heavily in the education of their children. Yes?
No, I was just yawning.
Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry, Lisa. They also invested very heavily in the education of their children as a community. Rabbinical schools are some of the most industrious education centers that you can find in the middle of European cities. So when it came time for entrance exams into college, a lot of times Jewish children were more prepared than the country children who had come in with their families to join the factories. We find this evidence in, for example, Hitler, who was an art student in Austria who couldn't get a place in an art school because they said, you know, the spots had all been taken up by people that were more qualified than he was, and he noticed that there seemed to be a large number of Jews among them and felt like if those Jews had not been allowed to hold those spots, then there would have been room for him. Wagner, who's a composer, put out a lot of writing about how Jews were taking things away from people. And somewhere in the middle of this, there began to be a sort of a legendary, not quite true idea that all Jews wanted to be part of the same nation, and that nation was not whatever nation they were living in. So French Jews didn't want to be French, they wanted to be part of the Jewish global nation. English Jews didn't want to be English, they didn't want to give their loyalty to the crown, they wanted to be part of this. And eventually, if we let them, then they'll take over and create that global nation, and we'll all be subservient to them, which would have come as a real surprise to the Jews, because they would, wait, no, I'm French, I've been here my whole life. Or I'm German, I've been here my whole life. My whole family we're just Jewish, but we're also German, we've been here for generations. What are you talking about? So a lot of, in Germany especially, a lot of that anti-Semitism centers around things that were written by Martin Luther. I noticed in the video that I assigned to you guys that it never mentions that he hated the Jews passionately, that he wrote, in fact, whole essays that said that it was a Christian's duty to eradicate the threat of the Jews, and as a result, whole Jewish villages were burned by people who were reading what Martin Luther said.
Yeah, probably why.
That's something that we kind of
So.
pretend like Martin Luther was a little anti-Semitic. No, he wasn't a little anti-Semitic. You got to read what he actually wrote and the events that happened as a result of what he wrote. So that seed of anti-Semitism exists in almost every country that has a strong Lutheran base. What were you going to say?
So whenever, like, Calvinism, like, they shifted toward banking and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Was he anti-Semitic or?
Calvin?
Right.
I actually don't know. I don't think he ever wrote explicitly about being anti-Semitic, but Luther did. Luther absolutely wrote about how evil the Jews were, and his people listened, and then they had riots. So deep in the core of a lot of those German countries is this thread of anti-Semitism. And the fear of people who followed Marx was that they didn't care about where the borders were. So workers of the world unite was the call of the socialists. So it was this, idea of everybody who follows Marx and is a socialist doesn't have their loyalty to their kingdom. They want all of the kingdoms to fall. It was a global uprising that Marx was saying was going to happen. It was going to happen all across the world all at once, and then all of the world would be united in this one socialist utopia. So these people have absolutely no respect for the borders in which they live, and they have no loyalty to the governments of their countries. So the biggest defense against these class tensions, against the Semitism and against socialism, was to remind people that their biggest priority was to be nationalistic. You need to have your loyalty for your country. You need to be loyal to France. You need to be loyal to England. You need to be loyal to Germany, which is going to be a real country now. We've decided that we're going to take all these little countries and make one big country, and then you're going to be loyal to that country. So nationalism is an answer to class tensions, okay? Because if you are an American, you can't join forces, even as a socialist, you can't want to join forces with somebody from another country because your first priority is to be an American, right? So anyway, so that's how we end up with nationalism as actually doing battle with these class tensions. All right, so I covered a lot of ground today. Does anybody have any questions?
Why did you have two different triangles in the triangle trade?
Oh, if you look at them closely, you see, hold on, let me get it.
Two totally different triangles.
They're two different examples. Actually, they're not even that different.
Yeah.
They point in slightly a different way, and I don't know which one I like
completely leaves
better.
out England, and the other one leaves out the.
Yeah, which is probably why I replaced it with the other one.
Yeah.
All right, but they did trade directly to Africa at first for slaves,
One's like with,
and then mercantilism moves it up. Everything has to come through
one's like the
London.
non-neglect, and the other one isn't.
Yeah, this is the triangle trade under salutary neglect. This is under
Salutary.
mercantilism.
So you check that.
Salutary neglect, yes. Okay, anybody else?